Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Rabbi yassir wa a'in ya kareem waftah bil haqqi innaka al-fattahul alim. I think you've already heard more than enough from me today, so this is going to be, luckily for you, a relatively short session. We will be praying Isha, inshallah, as forecast at 8:30, inshallah ta'ala. So in this brief session, I thought what I'd do would be to round off the discussion that I attempted yesterday about the nature and purpose and historical form of Islamic education. And I want to do this first of all by making a point that perhaps I haven't adequately made so far, which is that Islamic education is inclusive of male and female participants and also male and female teachers. One of the unique features of classical Islam was its integration of women into not just the basic practices of the religion, the 5 pillars obviously equally incumbent upon both sexes, which is fairly remarkable in the world religions. If you look at, say, Judaism, where women basically can't pray, classical rabbinical Judaism, they don't pray. Islam is quite striking in that respect. And in education, women have also played a very conspicuous, distinguished, but often underestimated role. In Kana Lana Umr, I will talk about some other aspects of gender in Islam later on in this series when we come to look at Imam al-Ghazali's discussion of the question of human sexuality. But for our purposes now, we need to be aware that Islam, uniquely among pre-modern civilizations, has provided not just education for women, but also has provided women educators. And the precedent for this is, as we would expect, the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, mothers of the believers, the wives of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The fact that they, during his lifetime and after his death, became educators is a sufficient indication of the intentions of the lawgiver with regard to the educational value of women. It's frequently pointed out that much of the edifice of Islam actually depends on these women scholars. Without people like Salama, Aisha, Maymuna, Habiba, and other very distinguished female luminaries in the first generation of Islam, Islam as we know it would not exist. Because these people, these women, conserved from the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam so many hadith, so many insights, they offered so many fatwas, they had so much fiqh, that were it not for their testimony, Islam as we know it would not exist. So we can say that the argument that Islam undervalues the testimony of women collapses completely when it becomes evident that the Salaf themselves, and indeed all subsequent Islamic scholarship, esteems a fatwa of a female companion no less absolutely than it esteems the fatwa of a male companion. And the fact that a figure, a rawi or rawiyah in the isnad of a hadith is female is completely irrelevant to the soundness of that hadith. An important point. So the sahabiyat radiyallahu anhunna, and there were many, were the first generation of women scholars in Islam, and really the first women scholars on a substantial scale that the world has ever seen. After the death of the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, they would sit in the mosque and they would teach, particularly Aisha al-Mu'mineen radiyallahu anha. She was known for her fatwas, and people would come to her for arbitration, for judgments, and for her teaching, public teaching in the mosque. In the generation of the Tabi'een, this tradition was maintained by people like Aisha bint Talha and Darda. Darda in particular, one of the greatest scholars amongst the Tabi'een. She dies in the year 81 and narrates some of the most important hadiths of Islam, also well known for her fiqh. We find also in this generation of the Tabi'een, one of the most distinguished students of Aisha was a lady called Amra bint Abdul Rahman. Her particular speciality, as so often with women scholars in Islam, was hadith. And we know that the Khalifa, the Mujaddid Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, ordered the chief Qadi of Medina to write down all of the hadith that had been narrated on her authority. So precious and so reputable were these hadith that the Khalifa himself ordered that these hadiths be written down and preserved for posterity. And this tradition continues and blossoms, so that we find, for instance, in the 5th century, in Central Asia, near contemporary of Imam al-Ghazali, the best-known transmitter of the Sahih of Imam Bukhari in the entire Islamic world was a lady called Karima al-Marwaziyah. As her name indicates, she is from Maru, which is in Central Asia, one of the great cities of Khorasan. She was one of the teachers of al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, universally revered and respected. People would travel from all corners of the Islamic world to sit in her mosque and to hear hadith from her. And this goes on, and the numbers were very considerable. Ibn Asakir, for instance, in Damascus, lists his teachers, and the list includes 1,200 male teachers and no fewer than 80 female teachers. A proportion not that unfamiliar even to those who work in modern universities. That's about the proportion that you find of full professors who are women in most universities in England. But this is medieval Islam. Another nail in the coffin of those who like to present Islam as an irreducibly patriarchal anti-female tradition. In the heyday of Muslim scholarship, as in the early days of Islam, that was simply not the case. The tradition continued, but seems to have petered out sometime in the 13th Islamic century. The last great female muhadditha, universally known of repute in the Islamic world, was a lady called Fatima al-Fudayliyah, rahmatullahi alayha, who died about, almost 200 years ago in Mecca. Really distinguished muhadditha and great ocean of hadith and also of fiqh. Since that time, the tradition has gone into eclipse, although it was still the case 70 or 80 years ago, when Mecca was still a great centre of knowledge, that there were women hadith scholars who were teaching. And one of my teachers in Mecca, Sheikh Muhammad Yasin al-Fadani, Allah yarhamuh, used to speak of how in his youth he would study with some of the female scholars of hadith in the haram in Mecca. Those of you who have done Hajj or Umrah will assume that the structure in Mecca, the haram, is basically for people to do ibadah, but in fact, until extremely recently, a generation or two ago, it was also a great Islamic university, and people would go there to study as well as to do ibadah. But for various reasons, that has now been almost entirely brought to a standstill as the country and the region switches to Western-style universities and moves teaching out of the mosques. So these women taught in the mosques, but they also taught in madrasas, and particularly in the Mamluk period, madrasas were established for women, sometimes by women as well. Perhaps the best known in medieval Cairo was something called Al-Madrasat al-Saqlatuniyah, which was paid for by a wealthy lady, established as a waqf, and all of the students there were women, all of the lecturers there were women, and there was a musalla, a small mosque, attached to the building where the women would be led in prayers by an imama, by a female imam. One of the most distinguished, honourable institutions of medieval Cairo. In Damascus there was the Khatun Madrasa, which performed a similar function. The Zumurrud Madrasa in Halab, in Aleppo, in Syria, and elsewhere in the Middle East. So that's one aspect of classical Islamic education that we need to bear in mind, that it's easy to forget nowadays because these traditions have been so drastically eclipsed. Of course, now in many Islamic universities they have attempted to revive this by opening women's faculties. The Azhar for the past 30 years has had a Kulliyat al-Banat al-Islamiyya, but the tradition of women professors and women teachers has almost completely vanished. So much for that. Let me talk now a little bit about the akhlaq of the teacher. I mentioned that Islamic education is about human transformation, not merely about the transmission of knowledge. And the fact that it is that the acquisition of knowledge is a form of ibadah completely suffused the educational process in the classical Islamic world with a sense of the sacred. That everything about the class was treated with extraordinary reverence and dignity. It was a formal, very respectful, dignified, sober, austere, sacred experience to be present in any traditional transmission of sacred knowledge from a teacher to a pupil. It was a holy event, utterly unlike the modern American university setting, for instance, where the professor comes in and half of the students are still drinking Coke, or they've got their boots up on the desk in front of them reading the student newspaper, and the idea of this being a sacred event could not be further from people's minds. But Islamic education is about personal transformation and the experience of holiness actually in the process of inculcation and instruction. Let me read to you a saying that the ulama have traditionally loved to share with their students, which has been transmitted from Sayyidina Ali, karramallahu wajhahu, where he talks about the great status of knowledge and the inculcation of knowledge, some of his most beautiful hikam. He says, knowledge is better than money in 7 ways. Knowledge is the legacy of the prophets, and money is the legacy of the fara'ina, the pharaohs. Knowledge is not diminished when it is shared, but money is. Money has to be guarded, but knowledge guards its owner. When a man dies, he leaves his money behind, but his knowledge enters the grave with him. Money can be owned by the believer and by the unbeliever, but knowledge, religious knowledge, is the mark of the believer alone. All people need the scholar to guide them in their religion, but they don't need the wealthy man. Knowledge helps a man when passing across the sirat, while money is a positive obstacle. So 7 beautiful aphorisms from Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu, emphasizing that true wealth consists in knowledge, not in property. I have another quote here that I think deserves to be more widely known. One of the greatest Ottoman educationalists, and the Ottoman Empire was particularly concerned to inculcate sacred knowledge, and the great men and indeed the great women of the Ottoman Empire were busy in establishing madrasas almost from the moment of the state's inception. If you have the good fortune to visit the great Ottoman cities as they exist today, you will see the extraordinary size and grandeur and ambition of these madrasas. The great Sahni Saman, the great Islamic college in the Fatih Mosque in Istanbul, which trained the great muftis and the qadis that went out throughout the length and the breadth of the Islamic Empire. And Tashkeprizadeh, who was a great Ottoman scholar in the beginning of the 16th century by the Gregorian calendar, has a book called Miftah al-Sa'ada, where he lists the books and the knowledges known in the madrasas of the Ottoman Empire in his day, and the number of ulum is almost 400 different sciences which he says can be and are taught. Not all in madrasas, sometimes in, say, a craft apprentice master relationship. So he has everything there from tafsir, metrics, astronomy, the science of water clocks, the science of dividing up inheritance, sciences of agriculture. All of these are considered to be ulum, and all of these are available in his day. And then he says that the true educator has to have students who acknowledge 10 responsibilities. He lists these 10. These are the 10 responsibilities of the student towards ilm and the ulama. First of these is self-discipline. The student has to be able to control himself, has to be able to manage his time adequately, has to prepare lessons, mustn't be lazy. So riyadat an-nafs, a basic religious method and virtue, is necessary in education as it is in ibadah. Secondly, the talib, the student, must strive after sincerity of intention. None of what he does will be any good whatsoever if he is doing it for dunyawi purposes, or in a fit of absent-mindedness, or because, as sometimes happens in the Muslim world today, he's not qualified for any other profession. Thirdly, he says the student must constantly strive to reduce worldly distractions, which means that the place where the student stays has to be austere and simple, not full of games, distractions, unnecessary visitations from friends at night. Distractions have to be cut down, and the student has to have a deliberate policy through muhasabah of reducing unnecessary worldly distractions. Fourthly, part of this also is resisting laziness. You can't become an alim if you're guilty of kasal, or sloth, laziness. Fifthly, the student must accustom himself to the idea that he will always be a student, that the acquisition of knowledge continues until the moment when we enter the grave, that it's not as if we learn until a certain point after which we are ulama and then we just teach and stop learning. No, the process of learning, once begun, continues until our last breath. Sixthly, the student has the responsibility and the duty to choose a teacher who is not just qualified educationally, but is pure-hearted and sincere, somebody who clearly has been transformed by his ulum. Seventhly, the responsibility of the talib is to know at least the rudiments of every Islamic discipline and not to over-specialize. You can't be an alim if you know everything there is to be known about tafsir or grammar or asbab wurud al-hadith or whatever, but you don't know even the basics of the other disciplines. You have to be well-rounded, even though clearly at a later time specialization is necessary and inevitable. Eighthly, one of the responsibilities of the Ottoman religious student, the sufta, is to visit other students in order to discuss the texts and problems and lessons with them and to debate with them. The process of education is greatly facilitated if it's not just a kind of teach-yourself course, but if one is sharing discussions with other people who are on the same track. Ninthly, the student must never be guilty of tasweef. In other words, he must never delay tasks until tomorrow. If a lesson needs to be reviewed or mugged up, if notes need to be taken immediately after a lecture is over, then that must be done right away, lest one's memory fade. Tenthly, the student has the responsibility to know the nobility and the dignity and the importance of knowledge, that this is not a little thing, but this is something on which one's fate in the akhirah depends. So those are Tashkur Pirazade's recipes for success in an Ottoman university for the student. Now, Tashkur Pirazade was himself a well-known teacher and historian, a great enthusiast for the works of Imam al-Ghazali in particular, although he was a Hanafi scholar, like almost all of the great ulama of the Ottoman Empire. And Tashkaprizadeh then turns to the other side of the equation and lists the duties of the educator, of the teacher. And he lists here 9 duties that the teacher has to conform to. Firstly, he says the teacher must teach solely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and must pay no attention at all to the state of his own personal reputation or popularity or fame. Secondly, he must treat his students as though they were his own children. Thirdly, he must emulate the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Fourthly, he must be unstinting in offering advice and counsel to his students. He doesn't just teach them facts about the religion, but he is in loco parentis. He is like a parent to them. He advises them, counsels them, gives them pastoral guidance. Fifthly, it is his duty to condemn any vice or unseemly behavior that he sees in his students. It's his duty to do that. If there's too much levity in a class, or if the students are known to frequent unsuitable parts of the city, or if the students are dressing in an inappropriate fashion, or using inappropriate language, or treating each other disrespectfully, or behaving in an arrogant way towards others, towards menial workers in the madrasa, for instance, it is the responsibility of the mudarris, of the teacher, to intervene and put a stop to that. Sixthly, it is his responsibility to teach the student what is most immediately relevant to him. The student must begin with what is indispensable knowledge and then move on to the furu'. Seventhly, he has to encourage even the smallest children to learn. One is never too young to begin learning. And he must encourage in particular the practice of memorization of the Quran and other texts among small children. Because the brain is a kind of muscle, and to the extent that it's exercised from an early age, it will acquire the capacity to retain large volumes of information. Eighthly, Tashkaprizadeh says the lecturer's words must never be in contradiction with his actions. He has to practice what he preaches. Ninthly, he has to know the adab, or the proprieties of lecturing. Now, what are these? And here again I think that the great Ottoman alim has to be listened to with respect, because he was himself in the academic world and he is speaking from experience. Let me just quote him again. These are the adab of the good Muslim teacher. He says, in class he should conceal his irritation and should never mock any student. He should not laugh or crack jokes. He should be constant in his mildness, his dignity, his gentleness, and his use of wit in grasping the student's needs. And he should not be resentful if his words are not accepted, because his duty is merely to convey, and success is from Allah alone. There is no harm in his testing the students and ascertaining their zeal for knowledge, because the Prophet ﷺ used to test the Sahaba in this way by asking them questions to which he already knew the response. He should avoid all egotistic forms of disputation in discussing matters pertaining to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that would be to open the gates of misguidance. With elementary beginning students, he should not demoralize them by setting difficult questions before them, but he should progress systematically from easy to more involved questions. Whereas if they are advanced students, he shouldn't waste their time with simple issues, but should force them to consider the hardest problems. One of the ugliest of vices, he says, is for the lecturer to prepare a few lines before entering the lecture room and then to teach them to the students rather than knowing his whole discipline profoundly. For any ordinary person could teach like that. The lecturer should behave in a humble fashion towards poor students and have compassion for all of his students and pay attention to their worldly as well as their scholarly problems. Although he should pay the closest attention to the outstanding student, he should allow all students a period of at least 3 years in which to show whether they do possess such gifts. So that's what he says, and what we have here is the record of an educational system that was part of a complete system of religious discipline. Gravity, intense respect for the scholar, compassion by the scholar for the student. All of this made the madrasa itself a kind of place of spiritual purgation and purification. One left the madrasa on graduating, receiving one's ijazah, not just as a more informed person, but as a luminous person. The kind of individual produced by these madaris was a kind person, compassionate person, and a sainted person. Non-Muslims who travelled in the traditional Muslim world when these institutions were still functioning in the classical way did sometimes have the perspicacity to remark upon the kind of individual generated by these places. Herman Melville, who spent some time in Turkey, writes in his great novel Moby Dick that the great white whale ploughing through the ocean recalled nothing so much as the white-bearded mufti of Constantinople, whose bearing and dignity allowed him to pass serenely through the crowds of the Turkish capital as the masses parted in awe and respect in his presence. Probably that's all I need to say about the akhlaq, the ethics that pertain to traditional Islamic education. The best way of taking this further is actually to see it for oneself and to observe the exquisite good manners that prevail in the company of the ulama and the important role that their families play in their task. Particularly now that many ulama are teaching in their own homes, it's always touching to see, as I saw many times with the Yemeni and Mauritanian ulama, that even small children are integrated into the process of education, and that the sheikh will say to a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old son, we're discussing this issue, please look it up for me in this, that or the other book, and the little boy will trot off and he'll pull it off the shelf, and then the sheikh will say, I think it's in the chapter such and such, or it's on page 346 somewhere in the bottom left-hand corner of the page, and the little boy will find it and then reverently bring it to his father, very pleased with himself and integrated in an unproblematic way into the whole project of education and learning much in the process. Very different model to that which prevails in the modern West, where the children of academics are generally largely ignorant of what their parents are doing. But this still does exist, alhamdulillah, and in a sense necessarily it exists because only using these methods can Islam be transmitted fully. An Islam that is transmitted to us by any means other than the authentic Islamic method is not going to be true Islamic knowledge, because in a sense the medium is the message. So that a scholar who has a degree in hadith from a Western style university, and almost all the Islamic universities now, including the universities in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf and Turkey, are Western style universities with classrooms and examination systems and degrees aping the Western system, the BA, the MA, the PhD, that scholar, that graduate, is not an alim in anything like the traditional sense, and cannot be. Any comparison of somebody who has studied in the traditional Muslim system and somebody who is a product of the mass education Western systems favoured now by so many modern Muslim jurisdictions will reveal the extraordinary impoverishment that has taken place. Not just in terms of how much these people actually know, but also in terms of their quality. Because a classroom where the lecturer is standing in glory behind a lectern and the students are sitting behind desks, where there is a blackboard, where there is a bell, where there is a Western-style system of assessment, is not following the Sunnah, even if the Sunnah is being taught. Remember Tashka Pirzada's point that the lecturer has to exemplify the subject that he's teaching. The intention behind the establishment of these universities was in most cases a positive one. It wasn't an intention to subvert. But the reality has been a massive decline in the quality of the output of these institutions, with a concomitant negative consequence for society at large. In some Muslim countries, the system has been bureaucratized to such an extent that virtually the entire corpus of ulama that's now being generated is palpably intellectually second-rate. In Jordan, for instance, and Jordan is not the only country to have this absurd system, it is very difficult for a school graduate to choose what he or she will study at university. What you study at university depends on your examination results from school. If you do really well, you're allowed into the Faculty of Medicine, a prestigious profession. If you do not quite so well, then you become an engineer. And if you do really badly, then you go into Sharia. And that's the law in Jordan. The result, of course, has to be a mosque leadership, a religious leadership that is despised by the bulk of the population, that has very little self-esteem, and that simply does not have, in most cases, I don't say in all cases, the intellectual resources necessary to deal with the problems confronting Muslims as they interact with the modern world. So our system has become westernized and has become decadent simultaneously, whatever the intention might have been. But the good news is that the traditional system doesn't cost anything. That's the beauty of it, because of its origins in the experience of the Salaf. People who had institutions that didn't cost anything because they couldn't afford anything. You can instruct a classical alim to the highest degree without spending a penny, because the mosque is already there. You teach in the mosque. You don't need an administration, you don't need secretaries with computers, you don't need degree certificates, you don't need anything at all. There is no paraphernalia accompanying traditional Islamic education. All you need is the human beings and a space. So it's a very flexible, dynamic, organic system, and one that can, for that reason, inshallah, be easily resuscitated. It's much easier to create an Islamic educational setting than it is to create a Western intellectual academic setting. And inshallah, what we're now seeing even in the West with initiatives such as the Zaytuna Institute and a number of others, some in Spain, some in the United Kingdom, is the first move towards the reclamation of the most impressive and successful and glorious educational system that the world has ever seen. And because the model is Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, who didn't have a blackboard, who didn't have anything, it's easy to implement. The poorest communities can do it. All we need is the desire to learn and the desire to teach and something to teach. And inshaAllah, all of these three things are now coming together in many communities in the West. And inshaAllah, this is a great bishara, good news, inshaAllah, that ulama will start to appear to lead the communities in the coming 2 or 3 generations. We've been through a difficult period Our pessimism has been based on the experience basically of a migrant generation that has not been able to import ulama that have been able to speak to the new generation. But that period is now passing. Increasingly, ulama are returning from the Muslim world or beginning to be trained here in the West who are bridging that gap. And once that has been achieved, once the message that is coming from the minbar is in tune with the way in which the young generation of Muslims has been acculturated now into modern Europe or modern America, then inshallah Islam will spread like wildfire because it will be accessible and people are thirsty for Islam. Islam addresses precisely the gaps in the human experience that the West is complaining of. And we need to convey this message, and that conveyance is the process of education. So inshallah, may Allah grant a pure intention and grant the necessary resources and grant worthy students to all of those who are seeking to revive the great traditions of classical Islamic education in the West. This is a process whose importance cannot be underestimated, because on its success or failure really hinges, as far as we can see, and the future is in Allah's hands, the future success and salvation of the Western countries themselves. That's not an exaggeration. That is, those are the stakes for which we are playing. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala crown with success the efforts of all of those who are striving for the resuscitation of classical Islamic education in the modern world. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله تعالى رب العالمين.